Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we step into one of the most chilling, complex, and psychologically disturbing mysteries in American criminal history, a story where murder was only one part of the terror, and fear itself became a game. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, a man who did not just kill in the shadows, but demanded attention, challenged the police, toyed with the media, and vanished without ever being identified, leaving behind ciphers, letters, and unanswered questions that still haunt investigators decades later. Our journey begins in the late 1960s, a time when America was already fractured by war, social unrest, and cultural change, and it was in Northern California that a new kind of predator emerged, one who seemed less interested in secrecy and more obsessed with control, recognition, and psychological dominance. The first known Zodiac attack occurred on December 20, 1968, on a quiet road near Lake Herman in Berryessa, where teenagers David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were gunned down while sitting in their car, a brutal and sudden act that initially appeared to be a random crime, but would later be recognized as the opening move of a far more calculated pattern. Months later, on July 4, 1969, as fireworks lit up the sky and families celebrated Independence Day, the Zodiac struck again at Blue Rock Springs Park, shooting Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau while they sat in a parked car, and although Ferrin was killed, Mageau survived, later describing the attacker as a stocky man with a calm demeanor, a detail that would become one of the few eyewitness clues in the entire case. Just weeks after this attack, newspapers received a series of letters that would change everything. 3 nearly identical messages sent to major Bay Area newspapers, each containing part of a cipher and a demand that they be published on the front page, or more people would die, and for the first time, the killer gave himself a name, Zodiac. This moment marked a terrifying shift, because the murders were no longer just crimes, they were performances, carefully staged to provoke fear, attention, and a sense of helplessness. The ciphers themselves were complex and taunting, filled with strange symbols and cryptic language, and while one was eventually cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife, revealing a message filled with disturbing claims about killing being fun, and collecting victims as slaves for the afterlife, it offered no real identity, only insight into a deeply narcissistic and detached mind that viewed human life as a means to assert superiority. The Zodiac continued his campaign on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa, where he attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard in broad daylight, wearing a black hood marked with a crossed circle symbol, binding his victims, and stabbing them repeatedly, a ritualistic escalation that suggested the killer was becoming more confident, more theatrical, and more committed to creating a myth around himself. Hartnell survived and later provided crucial details, including the symbol and the killer's calm, almost conversational tone, reinforcing the idea that this was a man who felt no urgency, no panic, and no fear of being caught. Weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stine in the heart of San Francisco, a bold and reckless act carried out in a busy city neighborhood, and even more chilling was the fact that the killer calmly wiped down the cab, tore off a piece of Stine's shirt, and later mailed it to newspapers as proof, openly mocking police and proving that he was always one step ahead. From this point forward, the Zodiac's true weapon became psychological terror, as he flooded newspapers and police departments with letters filled with threats, boasts, fake clues, and increasingly elaborate ciphers, claiming responsibility for murders that could never be confirmed and threatening mass attacks that may or may not have been real, forcing authorities to treat every word as a potential warning. His writing style revealed a deeply manipulative personality, someone who craved control, enjoyed confusion, and derived satisfaction not just from killing, but from watching institutions scramble and fail. Despite massive investigations involving multiple police departments, federal agencies, and countless suspects, the Zodiac was never identified, and this failure exposed the limitations of law enforcement at the time. A lack of shared databases, primitive forensic science, and overwhelming public pressure that allowed a calculating offender to exploit chaos and slip through cracks. Dozens of suspects emerged over the years, including Arthur Lee Allen, a man whose background, behavior, and circumstantial evidence made him a prime candidate, yet no definitive proof ever connected him to the crimes, and DNA testing decades later failed to deliver certainty, keeping the mystery alive. From a psychological perspective, the Zodiac appears to fit the profile of an organized killer, intelligent, methodical, socially functional, and capable of blending into everyday life, likely holding a job, interacting normally with others, and feeding his ego through secrecy and control rather than public exposure. His obsession with puzzles and codes suggests a desire to feel intellectually superior, to outsmart both authorities and the public, and to transform murder into a twisted game where he alone set the rules. Unlike impulsive killers driven by rage, the Zodiac demonstrated patience, planning, and adaptability, adjusting his methods, locations, and communication style as the investigation evolved, which explains how he managed to disappear without ever being caught. What truly terrified America was not just the body count, but the realization that the killer wanted to be seen, wanted to be heard, and yet remained untouchable, a faceless presence capable of striking anywhere, anytime, and then vanishing back into anonymity. As years passed and the letters stopped, the case faded from headlines but never from memory, evolving into one of the most studied and debated unsolved crimes in history, inspiring books, films, documentaries, and endless speculation, not because of how many people died, but because of how completely the killer escaped justice. Today, the Zodiac Killer stands as a symbol of unresolved evil, a reminder that intelligence does not always leave fingerprints, that some crimes are designed to outlive their perpetrators, and that fear can be manufactured as deliberately as violence itself. As we step back from this dark chapter, we are left with unsettling questions that may never be answered. Who was the Zodiac? Why did he stop? And how many of his claimed victims were real? And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is this: the Zodiac Killer may have lived an ordinary life, surrounded by people who never suspected a thing, proving that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are not those who hide in the shadows, but those who walk among us unnoticed. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration into the mind of the Zodiac Killer, a man defined not by what we know, but by what we will likely never uncover. And as we close this story, remember, some mysteries remain unsolved not because the truth is unreachable, but because it was designed to disappear, leaving behind only symbols, silence, and fear that refuses to fade.